Hello everyone, this is Menz here. I'm going to be breaking down the Tier 9 German heavy tank Mauschen's armor here in this video. It's going to go hand in hand with a weak spot guide article I have on my website, wakuru.com. Feel free to check that out in the video description below. There's a link, and also at the end of the video there is one as well. Now, looking at the frontal armor here, it's pretty comparable to the Tier 10 Mauses as far as the setup. You have the lower Glaces weak spot, which is 210 millimeters effective before you account for AP, APCR normalization. And 210 is pretty hard for, say, Tier 7s to go through reliably. And also, some Tier 8s can struggle going through it every single time with normal ammunition. Premium rounds, of course, help with that. Now, even though it's green, if you're a Tier 7, definitely that's the weakest spot on the front of the Mauschen here. You might want to try flanking it or just running away. But more or less the weakest spot frontally is the lower Glacis. Moving up, you have the upper Glacis, 349 millimeters effective, same as the Tier 10 Maus. And you also have these kind of behind, they're labeled as behind the tracks upper and lower here. More or less it's space armor, and it's right around the top area of the tracks, and you have very thin 55 millimeter armor behind that, but it's 70 degrees. You can bounce off of it if your gun caliber isn't high enough, and just going through that armor is pretty damn tough. As you see, the armor values there, weakest is 394 millimeters effective. Just don't shoot pretty much at this area here, more or less, that's outlined. You're not going to go through it. So moving up, let's start with the turret. So the turret front here, looking at the value here, turret 1 essentially, same as the Maus. Outside of the Mantlet, you have weaker armor on the turret front where it's kind of flat, but this is still 240 millimeters effective, and above and below it 255, 259. So pretty damn strong for a Tier 9 still. 9s and 10s can go through it, especially with premium rounds, same with 8s, but standard rounds from 7s and 8s is not really going to go through this area very effectively for most tanks. There's always the outliers with a lot of penetration. And then moving to the Mantlet, essentially the Mantlet, the top area here, this little weak spot, you don't have any armor behind it, so that's 248 and then 244 just beneath that. And the turret ring right in the center beneath the Mantlet is 254. So all these spots, even though they're highlighted in yellow, for most tanks this is still hard to go through. That's how good the Mauschen's armor is. Yes, the lower Glacis at 210, premium rounds can negate it, but for the most part, most of these spots are very difficult to go through. Now the Cupola kind of lulls you into a sense of, oh, this looks very weak. It's very large, easy to hit here. However, starting at the Cupola center, so basically straight down the center here, the weakest spot is right in the center where it's not really angled, and high and low gets a little bit stronger. That's 243 to 257. Once you start bumping out to the next little outer center area here, it's still yellow and orange, 256, 268 millimeters effective, and the very edges at minimum are 319 millimeters effective. So the Cupola is not really a weak spot, for Tier 9, Tier 10 mainly, because even 9s will struggle going through the Cupola of regular rounds. It's not really a weak spot. It kind of tricks you into thinking it is. Like, you can go through it, but it's definitely not a weak spot in the sense that you're going to penetrate it like, say, 70, 80, 90% of the time. So anyway, switching to the next little view here, we have an angled view. I'm going to try to line this up the best I can. There we go. So more or less like the Tier 10 Maus, it's actually a little bit easier to hit the Mauschen's weak spots when it's angled. You have a couple little yellow areas here in the Cupola, turret ring, and also just on the side hole here. However, what you're going to want to aim for is, just like on the Maus, this little area behind the tracks where you're going to be pretty much not guaranteed. Tier 7s and even some 8s can struggle going through it, but high penetrating Tier 8s, Tier 8 premium rounds, Tier 9 and 10 can go through here, because the Maus has a little additional space armor plate across the front of the tracks here. The Mauschen does not. have as much space armor covering it low, so it's easier to hit the Mauschen's kind of angled weak spot here. Now going on to the side, luckily for most people, the armor dramatically decreases to the point where you can penetrate it, whereas the front is 210 at its weakest. The side here, the main weak area is 155 at the weakest, and that is the upper side hull here. You do not want to aim low. Just like the tier 10 mouse, the Mauschen's lower armor is very difficult to pen, 280, because you have 100 millimeters of space armor, 50 millimeters from the tracks, and then 120 from the actual hull armor. And then if you don't aim in the right spot, all this purple area you cannot do any HP damage to. There's no hull armor behind it. So moving up, you have the turret ring, kind of strong, 254. You're not going to want to aim at that, but just above it is the side turret 2 value there. It's 160 millimeters flat, pretty easy to pen for even tier 7s, and then 184 for the rest of the side turret front, outside of this thick area that kind of bleeds over from the front. And the cupola also gets a little bit weaker on the side because it's not as thick, 177 millimeters and 190 for pretty much the center areas, and you're not going to want to hit the edges because it's a little bit stronger there, 231 to 319. So really, like kind of even the tier 10 mouse, the Mauschen takes a step down as far as the armor goes. You want to aim at the upper side hull and also the side turret. This is the weakest spot, this little triangle here. However, most of the side turret is weak, even the tier 7 tanks. So finally, getting onto the rear armor here. Let's just line this baby up the best I can. There we go. So the rear armor, while it's still strong for, if you're against 7s, especially if you angle it a little bit, for the most part, it's pretty damn weak, especially when you compare it to the tier 10 mouse. Being at tier 9, since you do have to face a lot more 7s and 8s, even though the 10 doesn't face 7s. They kind of have to balance it for that. And if it had the rear armor of the tier 10 mouse, it would be a little bit ridiculous. But anyway, starting at the rear turret, 155, a little bit lower down, 151, and then the turret ring's stronger. But the rear turret, going to be a very flat, easy weak spot to hit. And then the upper rear hull, 176, the center little strip here, 136, and then 157 on the very bottom. And then just like the front, you have this area here, which is space armor, track armor, stuff like that. You don't really want to aim at it. You range anywhere at the very weakest, this little itty bitty square here, these two little things, where you don't hit track armor, but you possibly can hit hull armor. It mainly refers to like if you're looking at it from this angle. So from that angle, it's 259 at the weakest, but the majority of it is 299 up to 349. So just don't aim at this area. It's not smart, unless it's your only hope if it's angled. If I take this off, if it is angled for whatever reason, the rear hull, and you can't pen the flat areas of the back, you can shoot through, like the front, basically hitting this side hull here and just going through the tracks and the side hull. But anyway, the tier 9 Mauschen has a ton of armor. Yes, it has its weak spots. Against 9s and 10s, most of the armor, like the flat bits, on the turret front, the lower glaces, the side hull and stuff, it is weak enough to where they're going to go through it pretty reliably, unless they're throwing standard rounds and they kind of miss their marks. And if you angle correctly, like you never want to present your Mauschen flat onto people. You just always want to keep it just slightly angled. And if they start aiming at this spot, you just want to, keep it at a point where they're not going to be able to penetrate this little side weak spot very effectively. But more or less, the armor is very good. Tier 7s, 8s, and some 9s will struggle against it. And 9s and 10s, still get bounces off of the Mauschen. It's just, there are areas that they can pen you if you're not careful. So always keep wiggling a little bit, stay at mid-range, never stop moving too much. But the armor on it is damn good. But anyway, hopefully this video helped you out a little bit. Like I said, at the end of this video, it should be popping up here any second. If it hasn't already, there's a link to the full weak spot guide on my website, and also in the video description below, there's a link to it as well. Have a nice day. Hopefully this helped you out, and you'll be able to take these out in World of Tanks pretty easily now. Have a good day.